fortunate to have our conversation this afternoon with Bob Nardelli. I probably don't need to tell most of the people in this room who he is. I asked Mr. Nardelli for a bio, a resume to introduce him, and he gave me 3 sentences. They were short sentences, so he gets right to the point. Chairman and CEO of Home Depot, also Chairman and CEO of Chrysler, and now runs a advisory firm he founded called Accelerate. For those of you who want a longer bio, I believe that's in the program, but I should note even the long version, Bob, does not mention your tenure as a bouncer.
That's by design, yeah.
So we're here to talk about different ways of understanding profit, and I think for a lot of us, and going with the theme of this conference, I think it may be a question of reconciling the needs of business and the needs of conscience, and how do we do that? Is there a nice marriage of the two as we think about ways to grow businesses as you have, and we think about ways to be good people doing it and to treat others well. As we think about it, I think most people probably do want to hear first, is there let's say a Catholic way of escorting an unruly patron out of a saloon?
Yeah, first of all, you pray to God that he's civilized, or he or she, and that you do your best in negotiating them out the door without getting physical. Because many times they were a lot bigger than me, James. That's
yes. Okay, so now you go from this is as a young man, you're just starting out, and you've gone to Western Illinois on a football scholarship. Yeah. And then you are fortunate to go to work for GE in Louisville, Kentucky, I believe.
Yes.
And the GE culture, I think, is maybe particularly interesting for this topic today, because you worked there and thrived there for a long time under Jack Welch, longtime CEO, and I think he is known as one of America's toughest bosses. So I think as we think about, can you be a good person and can you pursue business objectives aggressively, when you think about the GE culture that Jack Welch installed there, was it tough love, or was it just tough?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I'm really pleased to be here for the opportunity. Thank you. I've been fortunate throughout my entire career to be surrounded by great men and women who we really, tried to emulate a lot of what we heard at the Andreas opening comments this morning. And while we may not have used the exact terminology that Charles used in his book, Good Profits, it's as you read that book, I related to it in a very intimate way as to how I was fortunate enough to grow up in business and listen and learn and then try to lead. So GE's culture, like many great companies, really developed over the course of Jack's leadership. When I started in 1971, James, I was, again, God bless me, because it was a very tough year. And when I graduated, I took the test to sell Metropolitan Life Insurance. I was accepted into the management training program at Ponderosa Steakhouse. And then the good Lord knew that I needed something better. And I was able to get a manufacturing engineering job at General Electric in Louisville. And I tell a lot of the students that are over there, I started at $9,600. And a lot of them will say, well, a week? And I would say, no, that was for the whole year. That was for the whole year. But I couldn't have been happier. And Reg Jones was the chairman and CEO at the time. And he had his own personal style and put his thumbprint, on the corporation. And Jack came in much like the entrepreneurs that we see today, very passionate, very deliberate, very focused on driving excellence throughout the business. And I believe today, certainly myself, that I still have an infinite capacity to improve upon everything I do. And if I'm not moving at a rate faster than the outside world, I'm probably backing up. And I believe that, James, in the products and the services that we present to our customers. And we have to be customer-centric. So it's no secret, but a lot of people have forgotten, certainly the younger generation. Jack was dubbed Neutron Jack early in his career. And he created that infamous 3 circles. And if you were in the circle, you had to really strive to be significantly better, number 1 or number 2 in every industry and every business. And you were, if outside the circle, you either worked diligently to get in, or you were out, even more outside the circle, and he probably would sell the business. But he brought a lot of discipline from the standpoint, he talked about people, he wanted people that have energy, the ability to energize, men and women that had entrepreneurial spirit, that they had integrity, and they focused a lot on execution.
Okay, now, obviously that sometimes means being pretty tough with people who aren't measuring up to these standards, either on the character side or on the business performance side. Sometimes It means firing people, sometimes it means laying people off, closing factories. Is that compatible with living a life of conscience, or are there times where sort of you need to put faith aside and business is another thing?
Yeah, again, I wouldn't say Jack was tough. I would say he was direct. He was candid. He believed strongly in integrity. And as you and I discussed, for example, we had like a 4-block, and the 4-block would consist of individuals that had great integrity and made their numbers. And then you would have another block of individuals that had great integrity but didn't make their numbers, and so you worked with them. Those are the kinds of men and women that you wanted to mentor and grow and so forth. And then there was a block with no integrity and no numbers. So that was an easy block to make a decision on. They were what we used to call OTD, out the door. And the toughest block was no integrity but great numbers, right? I mean, that is the toughest thing to do, because now you're compromising your values, James, to your point. Mm-hmm. And my experience with Jack is that he would stand tall. And if you were abusive, if you were drunk with power, and you took advantage of people or customers, he would not tolerate it, even if you had great numbers. I mean, some of his learning points, I know there was an executive within GE. He called one day, and she said hello, and he hung up. And she called back and said, "We must have got disconnected." He said, "No, I'm just treating you the way you treat some of your people and your customers." And so that's not being tough, that's being direct. And Jack would come out and spend an entire day with every business and human resource review. And that took a lot of commitment. And he would start with me, and we would review our staff, and then he'd bring in the staff and they would review their people, and he would have skip level meetings without any management in there to really get a sense.
Skip level meaning interviewing or the people below, a layer below his
my direct reports.
Okay.
And so it was like a sensing session. Okay, Bob told me this, his team told me this, is that BS or not? And it was a closed, candid room, no retribution, no names or anything like that. And so then he would come back and say, okay, you said this. In human resource review, you'd say, James is a great guy, and he's ready and fully promotable today. Jack would come back next year and say, there's been 3 open jobs and you didn't promote James, so you lied to me. And it's not fair to James, because you keep him hanging around the hoop for 5, 6, 8 years, and then then you deliver the message, and now he's lost 6 or 7 years of creating a career where he could have been more prosperous, more contribute more, and had a better track record. So I don't know if it was tough. I think it was very candid, very straightforward. Jack is a Catholic Irish kind of a guy, and he was just he grew up tough. Dad working on the railroad. And he was a caddy, made his money caddy. So he wasn't a silver spoon kind of a guy. So he was a fighter.
And I guess maybe somewhat similar upbringing to yours. Is that maybe one of the reasons you hit it off, or?
Yeah, I guess look, I came from an all-Italian family. We were talking earlier, Old Forge, Pennsylvania, which just was a little coal mining town, and traditional kind of values. We didn't have a lot of money. As I told you, if I didn't get a scholarship, I probably couldn't have afforded to go to college.
Yep.
And I did work at Saga Food, mopping floors and peeled potatoes, and then on Saturdays, Friday, Saturday nights, I'd work at another establishment, recreational establishment, and only when I was 21, though, not before then. And but I learned so much. My values from my upbringing, and then the values I learned while on campus, both academically and in the sports arena, the importance of teamwork, depending on one another, was just invaluable to my future career.
And teamwork, obviously, a big part of the Welch culture. And as you said, principled leadership, being honest, being direct, speaking with clarity, these are virtuous and good for business. I want to, if we could, move forward to the end of your tenure at GE.
Yes.
Now, this is...
you make that sound so doom and gloom,
Well, it's interesting. You've been there a long time.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of people probably figured you would be the next CEO after Welch.
Even me.
Even So you get to that moment, and he actually, I don't think you knew until you were on stage for the announcement. Is that right? Or have you been given the heads up beforehand?
Yeah, it's, boy, you're really digging deep here now. So, listen, it got down to, I think, three of us: Jim McNerney, who went on to 3M and then Boeing, and then myself, Home Depot, Chrysler, and then Jeff Emmett was selected. So, I wouldn't be honest. I thought I'd have to go to confession if I said I wasn't disappointed and a little heartbroken. You don't spend 30 years. It's like I told Jack. He said, well, why are you leaving? I said, well, no one trains their horse to come in second, right? Having lived in Louisville. And so I said, if you didn't get selected from Reg Jones, you would have left. He said, yeah. So it was very, it was emotional, it was heartbreaking. It was a little bit like out of Casablanca. It was Thanksgiving weekend, and up in Schenectady, New York, it was raining, dreary, and then I got a call from Roseanne that said, Jack wants to see you. So, my heart sank and my stomach turned, because you knew that if it was the other way, he would have been calling saying congratulations. Okay. So you have all that anxiety. He flies into the FBO, and we have a discussion, in this dark, dimly lit room about he had made a decision, and of course, typical Bob said, well, I need an autopsy because I don't know why this patient died, right?
So you're asking him, why wasn't I the guy?
Yeah, that's fair, isn't it? That's not being tough, that's being direct.
Being direct, yeah. Right.
So, and he just, I think Jack wanted someone like himself that could do the job for 20 years, and I'm not saying it was only age. I think, he saw something in Jeff that obviously he didn't see in Jim McNerney or myself. So I was heartbroken. But again, the good Lord took care of me. I got a call on Monday. I interviewed in Atlanta for Home Depot Wednesday and took over the following Monday.
Well, I think this is maybe a statement on
it's a little slow.
Yeah. Maybe a statement on the respect that GE had and perhaps still has, that the consolation prize from not being CEO is running Home Depot.
Yeah, well, I don't. For those fans, that wasn't a consolation prize. No, I was very fortunate. Now, again, remember 30 years of manufacturing, stepping into a retail business. Again, there was this same kind of, Bob, you're not from retail. And there were a lot of people there that said, thank God you're here. There were other people that said, we know of you and we're leaving. And then there was a group of them that said, we're here before you and we'll be here after you. Now, I didn't know at the time they were going to be right. but so you had those three people, and we had to do a massive cultural shift, a lot like the examples in Good Prophets in the book about things that they had to do. I was telling James early, when I got there, I said, I'd like to send out an email, because that was kind of the culture. Jack was a fanatic about BlackBerry when it first came out, and he was obsessed with it, and so we all had our BlackBerry, and we were emailing. So I said, I want to send an email. And they said, well, you can't. I said, you mean I can't or I may not? I didn't know if it was a cultural thing. And they said, no, you can't, because we're on Lotus Notes. And basically to communicate, this was in 2000 now, you had to use...
I think the younger folks probably have never heard of Lotus Notes, but...
okay.
But
I didn't either when I got there, but...
and just to give people a little more background who didn't follow it, Home Depot had been a company that was a young company at that point, had
Yes.
grown very fast, and although it was spreading all over the country, it was still kind of a startup. And
Yes.
I don't know if it's right to say you were supposed to be the adult supervision, but you certainly were coming in as someone who was seen to be maybe bringing some order to a somewhat chaotic but fast-growing, exciting company.
Yeah, I mean, the board basically, knew. It's interesting that, what got them here, the board knew wasn't going to get them there. So in 5 years, we took it from 40 billion to over 90 billion in 5 years. So we were doing about 20% growth a year, and over 20% earnings growth a year. And we put a lot of discipline in place. We went from a very distributed merchandising organization to very centralized. What I found is a lot of the suppliers knew more about us than we knew about them. Each of the regions were doing their own pricing. They were giving away terms and conditions so they could bonus on their GEMROI. We talked a lot about incentives and...
I'm sorry, I missed that term there. So they could do what?
So on their GEMROI, which was a measurement on how they did on profitability per unit, per SKU, they would say, I'll give you better terms if you give me 2 cents off on the product. Mm-hmm. And so they would look better on their GEMROI valuation, and they would bonus. Meantime, we had a real cash problem when I got there. It would take, over a month to close the books. We were all, we were closing the books on spreadsheets. So I'd said affectionately, this was in 2000, I said, we're going to take a bold leap into the 80s with technology. So we put the entire SAP suite in, and the good news is no one knew we did it, right? And so, again, we more than doubled. We opened 1,000 stores in that 5-year period. We opened a new store every 48 hours. We added 130,000 net new jobs to the U.S. market. I was very proud we hired 35,000 veterans during that period. We had 500 junior military officers that would go through a 2-year rotational program, and they would come out and run a $100 million store for us. We sponsored the Olympics and Paralympics. We did a lot with Kaboom, putting playgrounds into very depressed areas. So we really tried to balance, I guess if I could steal the good, we didn't use the term at the time, but I hope in reflecting on it, we were really doing good things and good profits from that standpoint.
And I want to go back to the start there. When you come in, and I think this is could be applicable lots of different places, but if you understand you're coming into a culture where not everyone is happy to see you, and maybe not everyone is rooting for you to succeed, is maybe not eager to help you. Is that a challenge to maintain your values? And if your outlook is we are going to have direct, clear communication, do you worry about that with people who
it's a big issue,
maybe aren't dealing with you in good faith?
Yeah. You got to sort out the energy drainers pretty quick. The people that say, yes, Bob, I'm going to do that. And there were a lot of those. And I don't say this boastfully, but we did have to change out about 125 officers at Home Depot and to a certain degree at Chrysler. And that was a different issue, extracting a company from Daimler and then trying to stand it up again. So we did have to change. We changed strategy. and therefore we changed structure, and therefore we changed execution, which resulted in better performance. And we started Home Depot University, where we would bring in, associates. We had our own TV station, so we would broadcast every Monday as part of the educational process. We had our own training program, again, that we lifted from General Electric. We had executive management program and mid-level and then entry-level programs. So we invested a couple of % of earnings every year back into our associates. And because those of you that have shopped at Home Depot, the last thing you want is an associate to drop their eyes when you walk by. Right. You want them to engage. What are you working on? And we taught them to sell the project. If you think about this, if we got $1 a cart, we used to call it $1 a cart, that would result in $1.8 billion in additional revenue. $1 a cart, right? So we did impulse items at the register. By the way, we didn't have POS when I got to the point of sales thing. We used to do inventory on a legal pad with a pencil.
And the point of sales things means a lot of data.
Sell one, order one, right? And so we sold one, and then we'd walk the aisles to figure out to order one. And so we improved a lot of the operating efficiencies, the margins, doing a lot of things that way.
I wanted to ask you about that. We've been talking a lot about culture, and I know for good reason a lot of business school focuses on culture of management.
Yes.
But how important is math? And did you find at some enterprises you needed to kind of push math into the discussion when it was too much about qualitative factors?
Okay, so this is open the kimono and be honest time, right? So facts are friendly, right? And Harvey would attest to this. I have these little things about, if they would bring in a presentation and the only numbers were the numbers on the page number, we'd have a big problem, right? Or we would talk about schedules and they would put out a calendar and I'd say, I'm looking at my watch, and so, no, I mean, facts are critically important. Now you have to use them in a positive way. You have intuition sometimes, but I really have been and continue to be a pretty strong believer in numbers, facts.
And I suppose we talked about when you're putting people into different boxes, obviously that should be, it seems obvious that this would be important whether people are hitting their numbers, but
yeah.
Obviously different factors come into play.
Yeah, certainly, we had Dell Williamson that ran our marketing and sales at GE Power Systems, and he was, an unbelievable salesperson globally. He ran the entire global business for us, and his expertise was knowing the technology, knowing the customer facing, always customer facing, and would do anything to satisfy that customer. When we introduced Six Sigma at GE, for example, am I right, Harvey? And what we learned, for a period of time, my guys would say, the gas turbines on the dock were all done. And what we learned through Six Sigma is that we have to have a see-through accountability to our customer's customer. So it wasn't a matter the turbine was done. It had to be installed, right, for Southern Company, Duke, or whoever. And not only installed, but then it had to be running at an efficiency level that met their commitment to their customers. And so that rang true for me the rest of my career. And whether it was at Home Depot or Chrysler, we introduced at GE the long-term service agreement, whether it was with locomotives or turbines, and we signed up for a 15-year operating commitment. And if it didn't have a certain performance, if it wasn't, dispatchable in the morning, we had to make up power or operating efficiency, we made up on the fuel charges. And so it put tremendous pressure on me for our team to deliver on our commitments, right? Deliver on your commitments. And if you do that consistently, and if you take care of the customer consistently, your business will grow. You don't grow it by managing a budget. You grow it by innovation, product development. We created 27 brands at Home Depot. Now, you probably don't know that, but if you look at Glacier Bay, Hampton Bay, Rigid, Ryobi, Workforce, Husky, those are all house brands that we created in a 100,000 square foot bunkered facility called the Orange Works. And we did that based upon customer back. I mean, the Rigid tools and the Ryobi tools were a ton of sensing groups, focus groups. What do you really need in the pro tool, power tool? And we designed it in. And that's how we were able to really trump some of the major competitors out there.
Okay, I want to move now to Chrysler, which is probably, it would seem perhaps the toughest challenge, because unlike Home Depot, where you show up and it's a fast-growing business and you need to perhaps kind of put in systems and make it run a little more rationally. At Chrysler, you have a company, a culture that really has been failing to a large degree when you get there.
Yeah, well, it was interesting. You know, the old saying, how do you say Daimler Chrysler? Chrysler was silent, and while it came together, you know, from an accounting standpoint, it never really got together culturally, right? And so it was like a 100-year-old startup. We carved it out, and then we had to stand it up. We had to put in place all the functions, all the governance, everything all over again. And again, I was able to, you know, dig deep from my experience, and we put training programs in. You know, we did tandem teaching with our chief engineer and outside expertise. And we tried to resurrect the Chrysler culture. And you know, we bought that in middle of 2007, and we exceeded the stub period, everything. We had $9 billion in the bank, and then the financial meltdown started to pull us down. So we went from 17 million units a year, that's SAR, to about 9.6. So unfortunately, we had to furlough, James, well, I'll say 35,000 families, not employees or associates. But when you lay someone off, you got to think about it as a family, not a number. If you ever start thinking about them as numbers, you shouldn't be in that job, because you're affecting people's lives. You're affecting their families. You know, they wanted education, their home, everything. So you can never take that lightly, in my opinion. And unfortunately, I've had to do that over the years, but painfully. We had to shutter 5 factories. And to be able to get our break even to a point where we could keep the balance of the company alive. But during that time, going back to product innovation, you know, we launched the Challenger in 18 months. We brought the new Charger out, the new 300. We repositioned the Jeep. We brought the Ram 1500 out, Motor Trend Truck of the Year, 2 years. You know, we just went through, even with contracting business and less resources, not taking a risk. We would discuss, not taking a risk is the biggest risk you can take during that process.
Now let's go back, if we could, to when you first get to Chrysler. And this is a company with a unionized workforce, and the history is you know, not always a loving embrace between management and and labor. There obviously an adversarial relationship. So was that a particular test as you arrive and you have to deal with the United Auto Workers Union? Was it a test to be able to be the kind of clear, direct
I think
person that you'd like to be?
Well, on the first, you know, I'm talking with Steve Feinberg, who was the founder of Cerberus that bought it, and I said, Steve, I'm happy to do this. I did due diligence. He asked me if I'd run it. I said, sure, but I want to talk to Ron Gettelfinger first, who was the president of UAW, and I said, we got to have a good relationship, because we can't do this if we're at loggerheads. So I went down to the Union Hall and introduced myself to Ron, and he came in with a stack of papers and a sheet of paper and put it on. I said, oh, geez, what's this going to be, right? So he started flipping the one stack, the thick stack, and it was articles about how one of my former leaders talked about putting factories on a barge so that he could move them wherever he wanted to move them. And there were...
So Jack Welch suggested...
You said Jack Welch.
He suggested putting a factory on a barge because that way
you can move it to labor rates and
Right, okay.
And so there was article after article about union avoidance. And he said, now I'm going to turn over an article about you. And he turned over a blank page. And he said, so I can't find anything in your background that you were anti-unions or that you didn't work with men and women that are union representative. And so we got off to a great start.
Stay out of the press.
Yeah, well, no, I think it's do right, you know, and have a track record where you've done the right thing and you work with people. We would not have gotten through that if Ron and I and the UAW didn't have an open book. I brought him down to the design dome all the time. Here's the new products. Here's the 3 or 4 we got to furlough because we were losing about $500 per platform. And so we had a great working relationship. And to this day, Ron and I talk about every month. He's retired. He's retired, and I'm still working, and I don't have that pension, I guess is what. But
I think you're going to be okay.
But no, he's a great human being, and we wouldn't have gotten through that without his support.
So once the financial storm hits, having built this relationship, he would trust you when you went through the business case on why certain plants had to close and why those 35,000 people had to be laid off.
Sat right next to me through 4 congressional hearings and countless hours with Geithner and Bloom and Ratner and the whole group down there, Pelosi and Reed. Yeah.
And then, so you're still at Chrysler when this happens, and then the government ends up owning a significant piece of it and
giving it away.
How do you look at that deal now?
Let me get this chicken bone out of my throat. No, I mean, it's, I think this is sour grapes. I mean, I wish the government would have given us the same opportunity they gave GM. We submitted a viability plan that was every bit as viable. I think Washington did not want to take the risk in bailing out 2 companies. So basically they gave Chrysler to Fiat. And they didn't, they basically got a company with no debt, totally restructured with a break even at 9.6 million units, no accounts payable, didn't pay back $4 billion to TARP, and took the company, literally 100% of the assets, dealer network and everything.
And I think we could probably go on about how well treated, whether it was good business practice, what the government did to bondholders during that era, but I think we're out of time, so maybe the next conference.
We should have given him the book.
Right.
We should have given him the good profit book.
Bob Nardelli, thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, George.
Thank you.
What I'd like to do, first of all, before I get into the slides, is to make some general comments and general observations. And I know there are a lot of business people in the room, and you may think these general observations are sort of very, very stratospheric. But I hope you'll realise as we talk through the slides how these are actually important for all our daily lives. And the first observation I would have is that historically, the natural state of man is poverty and conflict. It isn't prosperity and peace. Prosperity and peace are things that we have to work very hard for. They are things that are the exception and not the rule. And I say this because one of the things I'm going to talk about today is the process of wealth creation, how wealth is actually created, and how, if we create wealth, we can lift the poor out of poverty. At Legatum, our focus is policies that lift people from poverty to prosperity. But in order to understand that, we have to unpick some terms, and we have to understand what we mean by wealth. The term wealth creation is used a lot, it's thrown around a lot, it means a lot of different things to different people. When we talk about wealth, what we're actually talking about is the realization of ideas. Wealth is created when an entrepreneur takes his hard work and his capital and applies it to his property and his or her ideas. And that leads to the realization of those ideas. That is what creates wealth. Wealth can be created or destroyed. It's very hard to create. This is why prosperity and peace are not the ordinary states that mankind has found himself in. It's very hard to create. It's very easy to destroy. And that is also a very important point that we need to understand. And competition, the force of competition, is one of the most powerful forces that we know to actually create wealth, to create innovation, and to do the things that are necessary to lift people out of poverty. So I think when we look at society and what society should look like, we want to ultimately create an aspiration-based society which is conditioned on ordinary forces of competition. In other words, that you succeed or fail based on the quality of your ideas and your capacity for hard work. And not on your relationship with the government, and not on your ability to change the legal or regulatory environment to satisfy your particular goals. And what you want to optimize is the billions of individual interactions between people, where you have people coming together in voluntary exchange to meet each other's need without distortions, either government distortions or other private sector distortions. They're not all government-related problems. The private sector also causes problems if it forms cartels, for example, or acts in ways that are uncompetitive. With that, I will go to the sort of first slide, and this is very much what the Legatum Institute thinks of when we talk about prosperity. When we talk about prosperity, we're really talking about thriving human beings. What can we do to ensure that human beings are flourishing in society? And we think there are two fundamental drivers here. There's economic prosperity, of course, but there's also social prosperity, and they are two parts of, they're part of two flywheels, basically. And the ability to have more social well-being, more social prosperity, drives economic prosperity and vice versa. The fundamental thing about this sort of construct is that, as John Adams said, this system that we talked about, what I talked about in terms of competition and the kinds of societies that drives forward an aspiration-based society based on voluntary exchange. That sort of society, that sort of system, is built for moral actors. This is what John Adams talked about. The government of the United States is built for moral actors. And that is where the pursuit of virtue, which is simply, I suppose a somewhat Aristotelian sense of this, that people are trying to be the best that they can be, and you want to create and fashion a legal, regulatory, economic, and governance environment where nothing gets in the way of that. What has happened in the world over the last 50, 60 years? We have seen a tremendous amount of global growth, and if you look at that graphic, I think it really brings home what has really happened in the world. In the last, between 0 AD and about 1900 AD, you had about a twofold increase in global growth, global GDP, if you like. From 1947 to 2001, you had about a 300 or 400% increase in global GDP, in global growth. That exponential, massive exponential increase was largely due to the institutions after the Second World War, which were designed to promote an environment of prosperity and peace through the reduction of barriers that countries had to each other. So we had the GATT system, we had a reduction of trade barriers, we had a movement towards trade liberalization. And that has been a tremendous opportunity for mankind. That has lifted billions of people out of poverty all over the world. It is a huge achievement. Free trade has been the single biggest antidote to poverty that mankind has ever devised. And that is extraordinary, and that has been very successful. I have been very fortunate in that my career essentially began with the fall of the Berlin Wall, and we've been involved in virtually every transition around the world since then. And what we've seen, reflecting back now on the previous 25 years, longer. I think what we've seen is there are three fundamental pillars of economic growth, and I'll come talk about this in a second, that deliver what we talked about in terms of wealth creation. And those three fundamental pillars are an open trading system, free trade, which has boosted so many people out of poverty. Competition as an organizing principle. In other words, again, maximizing voluntary exchange without distortions, allowing those exchanges to occur, allowing people to meet each other's needs, allowing people to succeed or fail based on their merits and their hard work. That fundamentally is a competition-led principle. And thirdly, protection of property rights. Most importantly, protection of property rights. And in fact, international trade and domestic competition are two sides of the same coin. So those are the three fundamental pillars. If you get that right, then you will create wealth, you will lift people out of poverty, you will create a fairer society, people will, and more importantly, and this is to the social prosperity piece of this, almost more importantly than the economic gains, you will create a different kind of person. You will create a person who wakes up in the morning thinking, I can succeed based on my capacity for hard work and my ideas. And nothing's going to get in the way of that. And that's going to create an optimistic, hopeful person, as opposed to if you don't do that, you'll create somebody who believes that if I'm born poor, I will die poor. And there is nothing I can do about that. And that will create an environment of despair. So these are not just economic, hard fact sort of economic issues. They are very much about the human person and the human condition. And the two are completely intertwined. They are completely interlinked. We have a tendency to think sometimes that there's the economic dimension of man and then there's the spiritual dimension of man, and they're totally separate things. In fact, they're the same. They're very fused together. And when people live in an environment where they think they can succeed based on their own merits, it creates a different kind of human being. It creates a different kind of idea. Now, in that 25 years, I think we did very well on the opening of these countries to trade, and I'm talking about the former Soviet Union and the Central Eastern European countries. I'm talking about Latin America. I'm talking about China. Massive increase in prosperity in China. Literally, 700, 800 million people coming into the middle class in China. Openness to trade was done relatively well. Protection of property rights was done relatively well. Where we failed is in the building of truly competition-based or competitive markets inside the border. And so what this has given rise to is a massive increase in cronyism over the last 25 years in many of these countries. And this is the opposite of what I've been talking about. This is somebody who wakes up in the morning and says, how am I going to influence the government to get a regulatory system that keeps my opponents out and gives me monopoly profits that I then plow back into the regulatory system to further damage the environment. And this is what has happened in the last 25 years in many, many countries around the world. And so when we see forces supporting protectionism or populism around the world, these are people who are saying, I thought globalization, liberalization was going to be good for me, but in fact I see, XYZ person over here doing really well because they're able to influence the government and do all these things. And therefore that means I must be getting poorer. They're not actually, as a practical matter, they're not actually getting poorer, but it seems like they are getting poorer. And therefore they react by saying the whole thing is bad. And hence we have Chavez in Venezuela, we have various other populist leaders around the world, and we have a rise in the power of protectionism to win people's hearts and minds, which we're seeing, again, all over the world. This is a significant challenge, even in developed countries. Obviously, I don't need to talk about protectionism in the US now, but in the UK, where I currently live, we just commissioned a poll, and we found, shockingly, that 70% of the British people would like to nationalise the railways. 80% of British people would like to nationalise the energy companies. 25% of the British people would like to nationalise the travel agents, which is rather odd. But what this is saying is people are unhappy with those services. Why are they unhappy with those services? Because too often they are in fact run by incumbents that don't operate by ordinary principles of competition, that are cronies, that do manipulate the regulatory system. And the result is bad service, basically. So these are very real problems that we face. Now, in the world, this lack of competition has led to some very concrete results. So I've got a graphic there that shows you global economic output over the last several years, and the big spike down there is the financial crisis, obviously. But the point I want to make is it's not that global economic output was doing very well and then suddenly collapsed with the financial crisis and now it's recovering. Actually, measures of wealth creation, and global economic output is a good measure of wealth creation, is down, has been stalled for some time. And it's stalled because we're not creating that engine of growth that happens when you allow the forces of competition to actually prevail. We can talk a lot about free trade, we can talk a lot about free markets, but the heart of the market is competition. And if that's not working, then it's not really a free market. It's a cronyist kind of system. And many of the critiques of capitalism, I would say most of the critiques of capitalism, are actually critiques of cronyism. And most people in the world actually live, they don't live in a free market system. They live in a cronyist sort of system, and they ascribe the characteristics of cronyism to capitalism and then say capitalism is bad. I'm not particularly fond, as an aside, of the word capitalism because first of all, it's not necessarily the right. It doesn't describe what we're trying to achieve. I think in a modern society, I think what we're trying to achieve is voluntary exchange, allowing people to meet each other's needs in voluntary exchange without distortions. That's really what the free market and competition is about. So here is how we look at the sort of three pillars of economic development. Along the base, and the most important thing you can do as a government is property rights protection. People need to know that their property is secure, and Hernando de Soto and many people have written about this. The top of the triangle is less well known and frankly less well delivered, which is this issue of competition, in the international trade sense, competition across borders, in the domestic sense, competition within a marketplace. And what is the opposite of competition? The opposite of competition is monopoly. And it's for a reason that in Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, the word evil is used only once, and it's used in connection with monopoly. Because monopoly slows down growth. It allows people to, there's a US High Court judge who's talked about the best monopoly profit is a quiet life. You don't have to compete, you don't have to innovate, you don't have to serve your customers better, you don't have to do any of these things. And that is why it has such a negative effect on wealth creation and on the economy. So what we see around the world is largely more successful approaches on trade and on our property rights protection, but still a range of cronyist activities, a number of distortions around the world. And one of the things that I think we need to work very hard on is the reduction of these distortions. But these distortions, internal, behind the border distortions, things that get in the way of the voluntary exchange that I talked about, these distortions are incredibly difficult to change. They're incredibly difficult to change. If you look at the last 25 years, particularly in the former Soviet Union, for example, we have companies that were $5 or $10 million companies in 1994 that are now $10 billion companies. And they will work very hard, the vested interests and the incumbents will work very hard to stop any kind of reform, which is why reform is proving to be so hard to deliver. And it's vital that governments around the world and the private actors around the world who are in a position to influence them are able to win this battle. Because if we don't win this battle, we will only see more of the kind of protectionist policies, reactions to liberalization and globalizations, reaction against what you might call economic liberalism, and the medicine will be worse than the disease, as we have seen in countries around the world. It's interesting, in the UK we're having a vigorous debate between the Conservative Party and the Labour Party, led by Jeremy Corbyn, about socialism. It's amazing that in 2017 we're having a debate in the United Kingdom about the merits or demerits of socialism, but we are. And Venezuela is a real textbook case of how quickly a country can change. None of this is, what we take for granted, is necessarily going to be with us forever. Countries can change very quickly. Argentina was one of the richest countries in the world at the turn of the previous century. Bad policies can have a very, very powerful impact very, very quickly. I wanted to end with a few suggestions of how we can actually make this better. I think, first of all, in terms of language in this debate, I think we have to be very clear about use of language and use of terminology. One of the things that I think we need to be able to communicate better, those of us who are in companies, those of us whose daily lives actually, assuming the companies are conditioned by competition and not cronyism, whose daily lives are actually lifting people out of poverty, we're part of that ecosystem of voluntary exchanges, of billions of human interactions that are all leading to wealth creation, to better articulate what we do. That, I think, is fundamentally important. And to identify the differences between, as I say, cronyism, distortion, lack of competition on the one hand, and what is actually the free enterprise system, and what is actually the free market system. There was a very interesting moment. I'm always wary of getting too deeply into politics, which I'm now going to do. But there was a moment in the 2012 Republican primary election between Romney and Newt Gingrich. It was very much a teachable moment, and I'm not speaking of the merits of either candidate, but it was a moment when Mitt Romney was being attacked because he was a venture capitalist and so forth. And Newt's reaction to this, the speaker's reaction to this, was, this was bad. You were engaged in these terrible things. And the response from the Romney campaign was to criticize Newt Gingrich because of his role with the government-owned enterprises, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, if you remember. And without taking a value judgment on any of this, Newt Gingrich's response was, well, that's the free enterprise system. I was making money. You were making money. I was making money. And I think this was a real teachable moment which we lost, which is to say, no, the free market, voluntary exchange, that system is not about just making money. The voluntary exchange system and the free market system is about doing things that actually create wealth, and that is a different thing. And if what you're doing is working for a company that exists because of regulatory barriers it places in place of competition and prevents other people having a fair crack at the whip, or you're engaged in government distortions or something like that, that's very, very different. These two are not the same thing at all, and we failed completely to educate the public on the difference between the two. But that is critical. If we fail to do that again, we will lose this battle. And the world will have lost. And then we'll look back on the last 60, 70 years as a sort of very unique moment. And going back to my, poverty and war are the natural human state, we'll look at this moment of prosperity and peace and say, well, that was really unusual. What do we do that caused that to happen? Because we're now back in the natural human state of poverty and war. So the stakes here are incredibly high. The second thing I want to mention is I'm living in the UK right now. As you all know, the UK is in the process of leaving the European Union, which is a seismic shift in the sort of global geopolitical, geoeconomic environment. And this could be done either in a positive way or in a negative way. The positive way is the UK embracing the world as it leaves Europe. And what does embracing the world actually mean? It means, given everything I've said about how a number of trade initiatives are stalled, a number of methods of increasing wealth have stalled around the world, and this is having an effect on people's lives, it's having an effect on budget deficits, it's having an effect on unemployment rates. Is this an opportunity? We think of this very much as an inflection point or an unfrozen moment where some things that have been stalled can be unbroken. And can be broken open so that this could act as a sort of galvanic, catalytic effort to restart the global economy, but only if the UK engages in the world in a very direct way in terms of trade agreements with the world, improving the very slow process that is going on in the World Trade Organization, for example, and other international organizations. So when you think about what's going on in the UK with Brexit, it's an inflection point. It'll either go in one direction, and Winston Churchill very famously said at one point, not in the war actually, in a speech after the war, he talked about we stand at the portals of majestic opportunities or catastrophic failure. And I think we very much in the world actually stand at that point now. There are majestic opportunities that we can embrace. There is a world of growth and a world of wealth creation that follows that track of that early graph that shows that exponential curve. Is a majestic opportunity for all of us, for all of mankind. But if we get this wrong, if we fail to make the case for voluntary exchange, if we allow people to equate cronyism with free enterprise, with the free market system, if we allow that to happen, then I think equally catastrophic failure does beckon. And we live at a time when the decisions that we make and the actions that we take can actually have a huge effect on this. So this is both a tremendous opportunity for all of us, but I also think it's a tremendous responsibility. If we do it right, then I think there is a great future, and one can be tremendously optimistic and hopeful about the world. There are certain truths out there that it's important for us to discover and explain to people. And if we do that, I am certain that we will have a bright, optimistic and hopeful future. Thank you.